Good morning. I'm Harry Chapman, Lighthouse Council Senior Consultant, broadcasting live from our offices in Franklin, Tennessee. On behalf of Lighthouse Council and our media sponsor, the Nashville Post, welcome to the GivingUSA 2022 briefing. GivingUSA is the longest-running and most comprehensive report on the sources and uses of charitable giving in America. It is published by the GivingUSA Foundation, a public service initiative of the Giving Institute, of which Lighthouse Council is a proud member firm. Today, you'll hear from one of our GivingUSA leading researchers who will break down the recently released GivingUSA 2022 report and provide critical insights on current economic developments and donor trends. Dr. Anna Pruitt, Managing Editor of GivingUSA, has dedicated her career to translating complex research into insights that practitioners can put into action. Following will be a panel discussion with leading global experts on philanthropy and social innovation, moderated by Susan Hochbach, Senior Consultant at Lighthouse Council. Welcome, and we appreciate all the speakers and panelists participating today and look forward to hearing their insights this morning. Also, we encourage attendees to ask questions throughout the program. If you have questions during any of the presentations today, please type them into the control panel. We will address these during and after the presentations. Now, without further ado, we'll get started with our speaker, Dr. Anna Pruitt, coming to you live from Indiana University.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you today. I love presenting these results, and I'm really eager to hear your feedback. So again, please really make use of that question and answer key on your Zoom panel. So let's go ahead and dig right in, starting with the big picture. Hopefully many of you are familiar with this pie chart. This shows where all charitable giving in 2021 came from. And what we can see here is that the largest share came from giving by individuals, which comprised 67% of the total in 2021 and $326.87 billion. Following that largest share is giving by foundations. It's important to remember that this includes grants made by independent, which includes private foundations, community foundations, and operating foundations. And that total amounted to 19% of all gifts made in 2021 for a total of $90.88 billion. The next largest share is giving by bequest. Giving by bequest accounts for 9% of all gifts made in 2021, and that is over $46 billion. And then finally, the smallest share of total giving comes from corporations, which is about 4% of the total. And again, even the smallest share is over $21 billion. The reason I want to really emphasize this is that I want to sort of emphasize how important the philanthropic sector is overall. Sometimes we hear that that little statistic that giving is 2% of the GDP, and there's a bit of frustration sometimes that it isn't a bit more. But when we think about the fact that the GDP is over $20 trillion, 2% is quite a lot. And it's really special that GivingUSA has this overall picture of where all of these dollars are going. There's truly no other reports in the field like it. So this is where all of the giving comes from. Now we're going to take a look at where all that giving goes. This pie chart shows the 9 major types of giving according to recipient organizations. And again, we have one that really represents the largest share of the total, which is giving to religion. That represents 27% of all charitable giving and over $135 billion. The next largest share is giving by education, followed by giving to human services organizations, and then giving to grant-making foundations. And just like on the sources side, this includes independent, community, and operating foundation gifts. Next up is the public society benefit organizations, which receive 11% of total giving. Public society benefit deserves a little bit more explanation. People don't usually know what it means right away. It includes a lot of pass-through organizations like the United Way, Jewish federations, and community development organizations. It also includes civil rights and legal aid organizations. So for instance, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is located here, as well as many independent research organizations. So it's really a bit of a catch-all. And then finally, of course, national donor advised funds are also housed here in public society benefit. Next, after that, the sixth largest subsector is health, followed by international affairs, arts, culture, and humanities, and finally, environment and animals. This is the smallest subsector, rather, receiving 3% of the total, and it still represents $16.32 billion. So again, very impressive. As a reminder, we are using the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities codes. So if you're, sorry, is someone speaking? Okay, I guess I just heard something. Okay, but if you're not sure where your organization falls, you can actually go ahead and just Google the name of your organization plus NTEE code and find out on ProPublica or GuideStar or any of these services where your organization falls on the GivingUSA scale. So those National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities codes, very handy. So that's the big picture. Let's dive right into the top 6 findings. The first findings is that economic factors drove giving in 2021. So total giving reached $484.85 billion in 2021. And that represents a 4% increase in current dollars over 2020. But when we adjust for inflation, total giving remained just about flat with 2020. Now, generally, this is really good news because in 2020, we saw record levels of giving in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial justice movement, as well as the recession that happened in that year. So staying close to those 2020 levels is truly impressive. The other important thing to remember here is that we are still well above pre-pandemic giving levels. So between 2019 and 2021, total charitable giving grew 7.4%, even when we adjust for inflation. So broadly, we're seeing strong growth over time. Economic factors like the S&P 500 and the GDP grew exceedingly well in 2021, which helped boost giving to these near record levels. So let's take a look at some of those economic factors in particular. We can see first up is the S&P 500. This tends to be the measure that we find most closely related to charitable giving. And it grew 26.9% in current dollars. That's still over 20% when we adjust for inflation. GDP grew 10.1% in current dollars. Again, that's over 5% when we adjust for inflation. Very impressive levels of growth. Personal disposable income, which basically represents the income that people have left over after paying taxes and paying for things that they absolutely need, so their disposable income, it also grew 6.1% in current dollars. When we adjust for inflation, that's not as impressive, 1.3%, but it still represents growth. And we know that this is important for your more everyday households in terms of how much they might be giving. So something else that grew significantly that you may be familiar with is inflation. So according to the measure that we use for GivingUSA, which is the Consumer Price Index or the CPI, inflation grew 4.7% in 2021. Now, inflation is not in our models. It's not something that we see that's directly related, but it is important. So you'll notice that so far I've already presented growth in terms of both current and inflation adjusted dollars. And that's partially because with this higher inflation rate, it can really change the results a bit. So I'm just bringing it up a little bit more than I might in other years. One other way to think about it is that when we hear about inflation-adjusted growth, like this 7.4% in two-year total giving, this growth that we see in total giving, and we know that that's adjusted for inflation, that's even more heartening when we think about the state of charitable giving. So inevitably, given the state of the market right now, we get a lot of questions about what happens to charitable giving during recession years. And helpfully, we happen to have a chart that shows just this. The yellow bars on this chart actually show giving during recession years. And this is also showing inflation-adjusted giving during those recession years. And what we see is that giving can decline in recession years, but sometimes it stays relatively level with the previous year, or in the case of 2020, it grew to record highs. I work with a lot of economists who are extremely fond of saying, if you've seen one recession, you've seen one recession, which is another way of just saying that the economy is extremely complex, and how quickly we recover from a recession depends on many factors, including which are the sectors that are impacted, what is the global environment that might be contributing to what we're seeing, and many other factors. So, it's ultimately quite complex. But ultimately, I am an optimist, as I think most fundraisers are. I think you kind of have to be in this field. And what I see when I look at this chart is that not only does charitable giving always recover, it actually keeps growing after these recession years. Perhaps that recovery isn't right away, but it's something that we always see. And this is also what's helpful about having this 40-year data set, is that we can see that these trends over time, we see that not only recovery, but that ongoing growth. I love this chart. This shows the long-term historical relationship between the S&P 500 and total giving. And basically what we see here is that when the market is strong, giving by individuals, corporations, and foundations is also pretty strong. And as I mentioned before, the S&P grew by 21.2% adjusted for inflation, just huge gains, really, really marked gains in the last 20 years. In the last 10 or 15 years, especially, you can see that this chart, it almost looks like a vertical line. That's how strong the growth is. So other factors to keep in mind is that it is the end of the year measure of the S&P that is closely tied to giving. So even when there's a mid-year dip in the markets, if there's a recovery by year end, that still has a very positive effect on charitable giving. And that's also because we know the majority of giving is still happening at the end of the year. So it's really that very, very end of year amount that matters so much. This chart also shows us that charitable giving follows the S&P, and sometimes it's a lagging indicator. That means it's a year, what happens in charitable giving is a year or two behind what's happening in the S&P 500. So sometimes the S&P skyrockets and giving might grow a little bit more steadily, and we might see the gains a year or two later. But this also means that when the S&P drops, total giving may decline, but not always and not nearly as dramatically. So those are some things to keep in mind as we're thinking about the rest of 2022 and what this means for your organizations. I also wanted to highlight this comparison chart because it shows us one of the impacts of this broad-based growth in the S&P 500 over the past 20 years, which is basically that the landscape of giving has actually changed a bit, in part to the very rapid growth in giving by foundations. So in 1981, individuals represented 83% of the total, and foundations represented only 6%. 40 years later, we see individuals at 67% and foundations at 19%. So that's a pretty dramatic change over the last 40 years. But despite that change, it's really important to remember that individuals still are the largest share of giving, especially when we recognize that individuals that are giving, and then also individuals are giving bequests, right? That's also individual giving. And when we think about the giving that's happening from private foundations, which are largely headed by individuals and couples, that's another form of individual giving. And it ends up being by far the largest bulk of the total, well over 80%. So that leads us to our next finding, which is that giving by individuals remains strong in 2021. The strong market conditions, as we've discussed, also helped to boost individual giving, which saw growth of 4.7% in current dollars, and again, remaining about flat at 0.2% when we adjust for inflation. Even with this, we see that giving reached the second highest level of giving on record when we adjust for inflation. Now, that was boosted in part by mega gifts, which are gifts that are so large that we actually have to make an adjustment for them. So for this year, it was gifts of 450 million or more, which actually represented about 5% of the total this year. That's more than we've seen in the past, and we're very curious to see if this trend will concur. This will include giving by Mackenzie Scott, Elon Musk, the Zuckerberg, Chans, so, all of those kind of mega donors that we sometimes hear about. That's important to know. It's, interesting, but obviously for most people, it's not necessarily extremely applicable. So what happened for the more average donor? Well, the one study from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project found that the total number of donors in their sample declined by 5.7% from 2020. And we also saw the donor retention rate overall decline. In particular, the number of mid-size and small donors declined. And honestly, this is not a huge surprise, because one of the things we saw in 2020 was lots of donors responding immediately to the new crises that were rising in that year. So there were lots of people who were giving in a one-time way for sort of emergency giving. But the good news here is that many of those new donors from 2020 actually stayed with organizations. So the number of retained new donors, which is defined as the number of donors who gave in 2020 and in 2021, but had not given before, actually increased by 26.1%. So there was some ability to sustain these new donors that came on board in 2020. And I think that's ultimately very exciting. Let's dig a little deeper into the trends that we see for giving by individuals. So one of the things we do want to highlight is that our research shows that high net worth households are giving at extraordinarily high rates. In 2020, 88.1% of affluent households gave to charity, compared to about half of households in the general population. And not only did high net worth households give at very high rates in 2020, they actually increased their average gift size, which many reported was because of the events of 2020. The gap when we look at secular charities only is even larger, with about 85% of affluent households giving here and only about 41% of the general population. The gap is not nearly as large when it comes to giving to religion, with almost half of high net worth households giving and a little bit less than a third of the general population giving to religion. So the other thing is that we see among these high net worth households is that giving is widespread across every single demographic factor. In fact, high net worth women actually give at higher rates than men, 92% compared to 86%. So if you don't have a program that is reaching out to high net worth women donors, that's something that you should potentially think about. We have a great question. How are you defining that high net worth? For the purposes of this study, we are looking at it's an either and. So we're looking at wealth of 1 million or more, excluding primary residence, an income of 200,000 or more per year. The other thing that we're seeing here is that this is a really great case for diversifying your portfolio. We see a really, really wide range, high rates of giving across every single race and ethnic boundary, across ages as well. Sometimes we have this idea that millennials and younger are not giving at high rates, but that's actually not what we see here. We see that millennials and younger, 81% of those high net worth households are giving. And same when we look at LGBTQ plus households, with 84% of those households, high net worth households, reporting giving. So this is really a case study for diversifying your portfolio of potential donors if you haven't already. Now, if there's one thing that's a bit of a call to action on the side of giving by individuals, it's the fact that we're seeing a decline overall in the number of households over time. So in 2000, about 2/3 of American households gave to charity. And in our most recent wave of the Philanthropy panel study with Indiana University, we see that about half are giving. We're very curious to see whether this is changing with the onset of the pandemic and all of the events of 2020, but it really is something that we should be thinking about and perhaps, trying to alleviate, because we really want to make sure that philanthropy represents all of our wonderful constituents. And that's really something I think that is true this year, but also every year going forward. Next up, we have the philanthropic landscape, which we know influenced all 4 sources of giving. So I've alluded to this quite a bit, but we know that giving does not happen in a vacuum, right? So the events of 2020 continued and new factors actually emerged in 2021. So the COVID-19 pandemic still very much happening in 2021. The racial justice and social justice movements that were really ignited in 2020 continue to be a powerful force in 2021 and continue to be something very top of mind, not only how people gave, but where they gave and when they gave. And then finally, again, we saw that inflation rate really increase and much more than it had in previous years. And we know that that was a challenge for so many different kinds of organizations, for instance, food banks, with the cost of food going up. So despite all of these different challenges and factors, the economy continued to perform quite well, as we saw. And we know that that kind of confluence of factors, which is that there's this increased level of need and increased sense of urgency, combined with ultimately a strong economy, made for a good year for philanthropy overall. So how does this shake out? Well, what we can see here is that corporations had extremely strong growth. And you'll see that the percent change is presented both in current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars. And again, that's because the stories are a little bit different when we look at both of those things. And what we see is that corporations grew very, very, very strongly. And on the other hand, bequests declined, and individuals, foundations, and total giving are somewhere in the middle. So let's break this down a little bit further. We know that corporations had a bit of a difficult year in 2020, so there was a bit of a rebound in 2021. It's great to see. Bequests are a little bit tricky because they're fundamentally just very rocky from year to year, and that's simply because a handful of large bequests can really increase that total in some years rather than in others. So just by nature, bequests is going to always be a bit rocky. And it's more helpful when we're thinking about bequests to look at how they're growing over time. And we do see that strong growth over time. So even though giving by bequests declined in 2021, it's still positive growth when we look at that 2-year picture. In fact, for all of the 4 sources of giving, we're seeing positive 2-year growth, even when we adjust for inflation. So all 4 sources of giving are above pre-pandemic levels. Now, I mentioned this a little bit, but one of the things that we saw in 2020 was that giving by corporations declined. That largely had to do with the decline in the GDP, which is closely linked to corporate giving, as well as a decline in corporate pre-tax profits. We saw the opposite happen in 2021, where GDP grew precipitously, 10.1% in current dollars, 5.1% adjusted for inflation, and corporate pre-tax profits increased 37.4%. So extremely, extremely strong growth in the factors that impact giving by corporations. It's also important to remember, though, that one of the things that we're increasingly seeing is that giving by corporations might include things that are not traditionally considered philanthropy. So one of the things we saw in 2020, for instance, and into 2021 was corporations talking about changing their supply chain, changing their hiring practices. Some of those things that are a little bit more difficult to count in terms of traditional philanthropy, but ultimately can have a big impact on the sector overall. Next up, we see recovery and resilience across the charitable subsectors. So we've really talked about what's been happening on the sources side. Now we're going to turn over to the uses side. And again, I've included both the current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars, just so you guys can get a sense of both pictures. And what we see here is some unevenness. So the gold bars represent what happened in 2021, and the blue bars represent what happened in 2020. What you can see for a lot of these subsectors is that there's 1 year of decline or 1 year of low growth and 1 year of positive growth. But overall, what we're seeing is that 2-year growth is positive for 7 out of 9 of the subsectors, even when we adjust for inflation. That's that column over on the far right. So again, we are seeing a sort of broad-based growth overall. And again, that's a very uplifting picture. In particular, some of my favorite stories from this year were that giving to arts and health rebounded after a relatively difficult 2020. So giving to arts actually grew most out of any of our recipient categories at 27.5%. And giving to health also grew at 7.7%. We know that there's a couple of different factors that help to boost this growth. One of them is absolutely that strong stock market. We know that both arts and culture and health are linked to the stock market and GDP respectively. But we also know that a return to in-person events really helped to aid these organizations. So that ability to get back in front of audiences for many arts organizations was really, really important. Additionally, we saw an increase in a study that looks at the top person-to-person giving events in health. So that includes all those walkathons, bikeathons, swimathons. We saw an increase in 2021 over 2020, and there hasn't been an increase in, like something like the last 20 years. So they're actually, not only does that tell us that people are excited to get back to in-person events, they're more excited than they have been in some time. So that was, again, a bit of an uplifting finding. Religion, while it grew in 2021, it ultimately remained about flat when we adjust for inflation, but that's not terribly unusual when we look at giving to religion overall. And that's in part because giving to religion is the largest subsector. It takes a lot to move the needle on giving to religion, and generally it tends to be more slow and steady as over time. To be clear, health and arts are not directly linked. They both are just linked to stock market. The arts is linked more clearly to the S&P 500, and health is linked to GDP. But it is something that we see if we were to look for a link. It is something that both tend to attract more high net worth donors. High net worth donors tend to give to these areas in higher percentages than the general population. All right, so there is another really excellent set of news here for in public society benefit, environment, and animals, and 2 foundations which had 2 great consecutive years of growth. We actually see, again, that public society benefit grew 23.5% in 2021 after 15.8% in 2020. Environment and animals, 2 strong years, and giving 2 foundations, again, 2 very strong years. Something I want to highlight on the 2 foundation side is that we saw the establishment of the Asian American Foundation with $125 million in initial commitments in response to the historical underfunding of investments for Asian American and Pacific Islander or AAPI communities. But we also saw that this coincided with some hateful events toward the AAPI communities, and we saw funders really responding to this. So the AAPI Giving Challenge, which was established by this new foundation, created a partnership with the Ford Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and raised a total of $900 million in commitments in just 2 weeks. So those pledges included in-kind support from all kinds of foundations, 56 corporations, and 28 individuals or couples. So what we're seeing is that there are people who are very hungry to make a difference when something is happening. I think that that's what this lesson tells us, that people, funders of all kinds, are responding to the events that they see around them, and they want to have that opportunity. All right. We did see for our 5th finding that some organizations faced complex terrain, in particular international affairs, human services, and education. So human services actually grew 2.2% in 2021, but when we adjust for inflation, it ends up being a bit of a decline. Giving to education actually fell in current dollars. And so sometimes people are worried about this, saying like, oh my gosh, like, does this mean that giving to these areas is in trouble? And the story here is basically that they just did not reach the extreme highs that they reached in 2020. So both of them had the second best year on record. They just didn't reach the ultimate highs that they saw in 2020. And so for giving to education, for example, a lot of the gifts that went for studying vaccine research, for instance, people thought that that might go to health organizations, but largely those went to universities, and that is housed under education. We also saw a huge wave of funding for historically Black colleges and universities in 2020. That's also going to fall there under education. There's also a lot of giving to support all of the efforts to have school at home and online school. And again, all of those are falling under education. So the story for all of these different sectors is not that, oh no, things are cratering. It's more like they reached an ultimate peak in 2020 and they didn't quite reach that peak again in 2021, but ultimately a positive picture and definitely a very strong 2-year picture. And then we'll go on to this final finding, which is that technology is expanding opportunities for philanthropy. So our wonderful colleagues at Blackbaud put out a very important report about how online giving is looking as a share of total giving for their sample of organizations. And again, no surprises here. In 2020, it reached almost 13% of the total. It's something that had been growing over time, but just as we see in lots of other sectors, the pandemic kind of accelerated some trends that we were seeing. And in online giving as a share of total giving jumped to 13% of the total in 2020. Again, 2021 didn't quite reach the high of 2020, but it's still 12% of total giving. So online giving continues to be very, very important. And one of the things that the pandemic did was to really accelerate this trend in online giving that we were already seeing happening. And then finally, when we think about moving forward, we know that nonprofits are going to need flexibility in order to kind of navigate the next steps here. So for instance, in 2021, we know that there were all kinds of new challenges, like the increasing inflation rate and all kinds of events that happened during that year, including staffing challenges, the Great Resignation that of course impacted nonprofits all over the place, supply issues, and elevated levels of demand. So I recently heard from the leader of a food bank who said that the levels of demand that they were experiencing in 2021 actually exceeded what they were seeing at the height of the pandemic in 2020. So we know that the need is continuing. We also know that there are lots of new ways of giving and they are increasingly popular. So donors want to leverage all of their assets and they might want to do that in lots of different ways, including giving through donor advised funds. I have to put a little shout out here for the full book. We have a new chapter on giving by and to donor advised funds. I highly recommend that you check that out. There is unique research in that chapter that gives a very full picture of what we're seeing across the field. And I think it also presents some really interesting information about where grants from donor advised funds are going. That's not information you can get anywhere else. And then finally, we know that technology plays a key role. So we saw hybrid events start to pop up in 2021, and it's very likely that they are here to stay. We see a lot of donors who really like these events, and even with the return to in-person events, might want to have this option. So increasingly, for instance, in the arts, we're seeing a lot of pre-recorded videos that you can be in a gala to go see, or you can watch from your couch in your sweatpants. And you know what? That's fine. It takes all kinds, right? So I think it's important to remember that there's lots of different ways that people might want to contribute, and there's lots of different opportunities to make sure that they can. All right, so that wraps up the top 6 findings. I'm eager to hear from all of you and to answer any additional questions that you might have. It looks like we have 2 questions.
Report and navigate current economic and philanthropic environments. Now we'll take a few questions from the audience.
I see that we have a question about whether religious giving includes tithing. And the answer to that would be it does, because of the way that we're collecting that information. So I'm happy to answer that question. There's also a great question about faith-based and health and human services organizations. And again, I'm going to have to refer you to the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities codes in order to see where an organization falls. There are a lot of organizations that might be religiously oriented, but provide human services, various different emergency services, and are technically counted, for instance, under human services. So the example I like to use is Catholic Charities. Catholic's right in the name, but it's technically a human services organization according to the NTEE codes. So it's really important that you check those out. And it's also important to emphasize that when we're talking about religious giving and giving to religion for the purposes of GivingUSA, it's pretty strictly defined as giving to religious media organizations, houses of worship, and it does not include all religiously inspired giving. So I think that that's important to delimit, that we are really focusing very strongly on giving to houses of worship and religious media. There's a really good question about how high inflation rates might impact overall giving. This is a very tricky question. Something that's really important to remember when you're looking at all of this data is that I would hope for you that you would be data informed and not data driven, right? Like you actually have to put the meaning into the data yourself. So one of the things that we might see with higher inflation rates is that people feel more uncertain. Uncertainty is not good for charitable giving. So, that really depends on a sort of donor by donor basis, how people might be feeling in response to these inflation rates. But one thing I will say is that even when we've had high inflation rates, we've also had years where charitable giving went up, and that's usually linked to growth in the market. So I do want to make sure that there's a distinction between high inflation rates and what the market is doing. What we typically find is that if we see periods of high inflation for a longer period of time, that can have a longer impact on charitable giving. But in general, there isn't like a direct link between high inflation and declines in giving, but it really has to do with how individuals are feeling about these different factors in the economic environment. So as always, I think it's really important to be speaking with your donors and listening to them and hearing what they're most concerned with. I see another question about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was actually passed in December 2017, and there was some question about the impact that it would have on charitable giving, because one of the things that the TCJA did is that it decreased the number of households that were itemizing their taxes. So it used to be about 30% of households itemized their taxes, including charitable deductions, and now that's really like 10%. So there's a huge decline in the number of households that are now itemizing their taxes. It's very tricky to say long-term what the impact of the TCJA was, because it's a very, very complex piece of legislation. And normally when you look at the impacts of these things, you're just testing like one or two variables. And the TCJA changed like a million variables, including variables no one had ever tested before. For instance, state and local taxes. There just was like not a lot of research into seeing what kind of impact that might have. So it's a little tricky to say overall, but we hope to be able to say something a bit more informative about that practice, or about the effects of that, once we have the new wave of philanthropy panel study data here at the School of Philanthropy. So classic researcher answer, but we have to wait for more data, and then hopefully we'll be able to identify some trends. I see that there's also a question about the transfer of wealth and planned giving. Yes, so demographic factors, we know that the population is getting older. I think that probably everybody on that podcast or on this webcast has heard that at some point. And that's true. We do see that the percentage of population that's over 55 is growing pretty rapidly over time. We also know that planned giving and bequest giving is really associated with older households. So this is absolutely something that people should be thinking of. But what's most interesting in this space right now is that that we actually see younger and younger people getting involved with planned giving and wanting to make a bequest because of the pandemic. The pandemic is the first time that a lot of people who are a bit younger said, like, wow, I actually need to get my affairs in order. I need to get a will set up. And so we've seen a huge influx of people who are using, for instance, these free online will planning services like Free Will is a good example. And there's just more and more younger people doing this. So planned giving is absolutely very important. It's something people should be thinking of. And it's also something that isn't relegated just to older households and older people anymore. This is something that younger and younger donors are interested in and thinking about. Another great question about what percentage of individual giving is driven by individuals. This is very tricky, or what percentage of foundation giving is driven by individuals. This is a little bit tricky because we don't have, the IRS doesn't require you to sort of make these distinctions. So it's always going to end up being an estimate. Some have estimated that it's as much as 60% of independent giving or independent foundation giving is coming from family foundations. Unfortunately, I can't back that up one way or another, but we do know it's a significant portion. And I think the other thing that's really important to remember is that we're seeing more and more that foundations and donor advised funds are, two tools, but not the only tools. So this is something we can really track at the mega donor level, but it's true even when we look at our data for the high net worth donors. Very rarely is the foundation like the only way someone's giving. It's the same is true for donor advised funds. Very rarely is that the only vehicle that someone is using to make a gift. There is usually a lot of different ways that people are leveraging their assets in order to give to charity. So I think it's also important to remember that while it's important to look at that foundation giving trend, that's not the only way that people give, and not there's lots of different, they might be using donor advised funds and foundations to make larger, more targeted gifts, but that doesn't mean that that's the only money that those folks are giving. One more question about the racial and social justice movement and whether new nonprofits and arms of programs of existing nonprofits and whether we're seeing more different kinds of programs and whether foundations are the main source of funding. I will tell you that foundations are definitely an important source of funding. We see a lot of foundations acknowledging that they want to give to, for instance, community-based organizations. And we see a lot of foundations also working with sort of arbiters, so like community foundations, or sometimes they're working with some kind of fund with a number of different donors and a number of different people who might be administering the fund, so that it gets to the organization, to smaller organizations that a larger foundation may not know about. I would also say it's definitely an influence that we see happening across the field in every way. So not only on how giving is happening, but also on the employment side. There seems to be a renewed effort to try to make sure that boards are diverse, and there's really good evidence to show that diverse boards are more likely to adopt policies and actionable items that are supporting more diverse causes. So board membership and employees at every level, that continues to be important. And it's something that's really covered in all of the chapters. Again, I have to tell you guys, I am the managing editor of GivingUSA, so it's not a surprise, but I do highly recommend that you check out all these chapters. I see another question about age groups and giving, and we have in the individuals chapter a whole section on generational giving. There's lots of really interesting data on this. I think it probably won't be a huge surprise to any of you that especially younger people are very, very concerned, for instance, with racial justice and social justice. We really see Gen Z saying that this is a major priority for them, and it's something that might even impact the kinds of organizations that they want to work for. We also see in general that younger generations tend to want to give to more kinds of causes, and that they're generally more cause-driven rather than organizational driven. So one of the things that we tend to see with especially older donors is that they build a relationship with an organization for a long period of time. And a lot of younger donors are finding out about a cause online and then making a donation basically to a cause. Of course, it's going to an organization, but they're drawn to it because it represents a cause that they care about. So I think that that's a really important piece in terms of the communication, making sure that you are clearly identifying how your organization plays a role in the most important topics that we're seeing happen right now when you think about attracting those younger donors. Finally, we see a question about cryptocurrency. So I think I would say about cryptocurrency that, it's like accepting stocks, just like not every nonprofit is going to be well suited for accepting cryptocurrency, and many that do sell them off right away. But I think that largely what we'll see with cryptocurrency is that they'll go through a lot of mediating organizations like the Giving Block, which specializes in taking people's cryptocurrency donations and making them available to nonprofits. Also, big national donor advised funds also do this. So I think that that's primarily how most nonprofits will end up receiving what used to be cryptocurrency, is through those mediating organizations.
Thank you for all your questions, and thank you again, Anna, for your participation today. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. Next, we'll move into the panel discussion on philanthropy and social innovation, moderated by Susan Hoshback, Senior Consultant at Lighthouse Council. But first, a word from our host, Lighthouse Council.
With a great team of volunteer leaders and Lighthouse's Sound Council, we doubled our original campaign goal.
They should retain Lighthouse because they get it.
It's the most positive, collaborative process I've ever been involved with regard to strategic planning.
Our team's passion is to see our clients succeed. Our understanding of strategy and experience guides our clients to fulfill their potential. Nonprofits achieve greater success through Lighthouse Council's Fundraising Council, Strategic Planning Facilitation, and Board Development.
I've worked with a lot of capital council companies. Lighthouse Council's the best.
Good morning and welcome to the panel discussion portion of our program. Joining me today are Dr. Benny Harris, who's Chancellor of the University of South Carolina Upstate in Spartanburg, where he fulfills his purpose to inspire and develop young people to change the world. He believes higher education offers opportunities for people to experience possibilities and achieve their greatest aspirations. Eric Higgs, who is President and CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Middle Tennessee in Nashville, leading the organizational vision to double the youth served to 10,000 by 2026. Prior to Boys and Girls Clubs, he spent 26 years in corporate America, most recently with Bridgestone, where he served as Vice President of Commercial Marketing, President of the Commercial Truck Division, and Senior Vice President of Enterprise Marketing Operations. Joanne Polis, Vice President of Community Engagement at HCA Healthcare in Nashville, leading a diverse team that manages all aspects of community engagement. She also serves as president of the HCA Foundation, guiding grant making to over 500 organizations annually, working with the foundation board to manage over $220 million in assets and $28 million annually in grants and matching gifts. Rachel Hutchison, who's Vice President of Global Social Responsibility at Blackbaud in Charleston, South Carolina, leading the company's social impact investments and sustainability, and helping the company's 3,600 associates be agents of good. And finally, Dr. Stuart Gulley, President at Woodward Academy, a K-12 private school in Metro Atlanta since 2009. He's an ordained minister of the United Methodist Church. He's also served in several administrative capacities at Emory University from 1986 until 1996, including the position of Associate Vice President for University Development and Church Relations. Welcome to all, and thank you for joining us today. So now let's get started with our discussion. The first question is for all of you, whoever would like to answer. You've heard the incredible amount of generosity given in 2021, $485 billion. Yet there has been a lot of volatility over the last 2 years as well. What have been the most significant changes you've faced and challenges that you've faced? And what effect do you think the current economic climate will have on giving in 2022?
Okay, someone has to go first.
That's right.
I'll start. Again, Eric Higgs, it's great to be here. And thank you all for hosting this panel and the great information that Dr. Anna just shared. With regard to our organization, a nonprofit organization, youth serving organization here, I'll tell you, we've benefited over the trends that Dr. Anna talked about in 2020 and 2021. So that has been great for us. The most consistent challenge has been in talent retention. I think that was mentioned in key finding number 6, I believe, textbook in terms of that being the big challenge for us as the market dynamics have shifted, meaning serving youth face to face, because we were deemed as an essential worker group, while competition to hire employees in that tight market to stock our shelves, to stock our warehouses and everything else you could imagine, that put tremendous pressure on being able to keep up with that market challenge there. So that doesn't take anything away from the work that we needed to do on corporate culture, ensuring that this is meaningful work and we've got flexibility in line with what staff need. But that challenge is real. And I think it really set up as I was making outreach to investors and people who are supporting our organization, really just stressing the importance of flexibility of the funds that we're going to be utilizing on this case here. And that's not always the most top of mind discussion, as investors are looking, how do we, continue to invest in our employee and staff there. So those are my initial thoughts and the big challenge that we definitely faced during this time.
Anyone else?
I would love to add to that, to what Eric has just talked about. And Susan, thank you again for the invitation to be a part of this particular panel. And I really enjoyed the conversation that Dr. Pruitt had. And what I would encourage people in the audience, the GivingUSA report has been a major guide for great practices that we have in our fundraising organization, that we have our institution. And it's a very data-driven report, and it helps us to really establish how we will advance many new emerging opportunities and how we become extremely aspirational. But to the question that you have asked, is naturally the pandemic was a major challenge for all of us and continue to be a major challenge. As it relates to institutional advancement, that's my previous role at Morehouse School of Medicine. I currently serve as the chancellor here, so I've been here for 1 year, but I can speak much more confidently around what took place in that first year. It really was learning to pivot, and it highlighted our vulnerability in terms of going both online as well as working in a virtual capacity. So when we pull together the challenges we have with staffing, the challenge we have with motivating staff. Imagine taking your entire team, whether it's the advancement team, the fundraising team, the data team, the stewardship team, and saying we're all in a virtual capacity now. And then pulling together a structure for which to motivate them, to encourage them to continue to be focused, to support their success, to connect with the donors. So early on, we just did a lot of servicing of our donors in terms of especially our elderly ones, taking food to them, even though they didn't need it, but just remaining present, saying, hey, I know you don't want to get out. We're in a higher education session industry. So we had food services that we were trying to keep them employed. So what we said, instead of just sending you all home, what we'll do is have you to continue to produce meals, and we would deliver those meals or have people to come and pick up meals and order meals as well. What that did for our staff was to give them a purpose of engagement. Now, during this tenure at Morehouse School of Medicine, our fundraising increased dramatically, and we'll talk about that later on in the session, but it increased dramatically because our mission was so aligned with what the country needed at the time. Being a historically Black university, working in healthcare, a medical school, health science institution, we had this dual pandemic of racial injustices that were taking place that were right there in front of us with George Floyd and a number of things. And you had this COVID-19 pandemic that was having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. So I think partners look to Morehouse School of Medicine for some solutions, very immediate solutions that we had a high competency, or we have a high competency in working with communities of color, because that's what our mission was all about, and producing doctors of color and those types of things. And at the same time, this disease was having a disproportionate impact on those communities. So funders were looking to invest in people who can help immediately to resolve some of those types of issues. So that was a big challenge, but at the same time, because we were so clear on who we are and what we do best in our mission, we were able to try to fill that gap, and we didn't have to reach to try to do things just for money. The resources was there to help us to serve the community better. So that was both a challenge and a vulnerability. But as we look at our current economic climate and giving, I think what we saw in giving is that if you do well what you do, and here are the needs that we have, continue to do that. Don't try to be all things to all people. And both folks in America and the USA are very generous, and they're going to lead and commit to help us to have a better economy, a better society, et cetera. I don't want to say too much because we have several panels, but definitely we had a challenge and we had opportunities all at the same time.
Thanks, Benny. Rachel, Joanne, Stewart, any
Let me
additional?
add just a little bit to that, just from the perspective of a foundation. So I feel I'm among friends. I'm a Methodist. I graduated from Emory University. I'm a funder of Boys and Girls Club and a big client of Blackbaud. So nice to be with you all today. And thank you for your wisdom that you're sharing. I'm going to be short, but I really think for foundations, it was all about balancing our portfolio of being reactive to those emerging needs that Dr. Harris is talking about. And we actually did give to HBCUs. We have a new commitment of $10 million over the next few years. And then also being very proactive around issues like health equity that are near and dear to our business. So that's just, for us, it was all about how do we keep that right balance.
Joanne?
Yes, Susan, thank you so much for having me. And I'll just add that, and normally in a situation of a disaster, one sector is helping another, maybe companies are coming in and helping nonprofits, or one community is helping another because it happens in a certain geography. And this disaster, the pandemic, it affected everybody. And something that happened around the world actually affected us in our homes and our neighbors. And that was a very different experience for all of us. So when it came to Blackbaud, so much changed, I couldn't even give you the list. We went virtual overnight, 3,200 people got an email. I was actually at a Giving Institute meeting and said, come in and get your computer, we're going remote. We had to keep supporting all of our customers without them really noticing. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. While, food banks were raising money, off the charts and needed more and more support than ever, arts organizations were closing their doors. It was like completely across the spectrum. And we had people working in their homes with their kids and their aging parents and thinking about their mental health and their stress and all of that. So the focus on our people increased dramatically and continues. And the other thing I'll say, though, that is really, really positive as well is that we saw our nonprofit customers actually use the digital tools that they already had far better than they ever have, because they actually got over this idea that you couldn't do this, that oh, no, we have to be in person, or you couldn't offer certain services in a digital or virtual way. And so they were innovative, and they're keeping that innovation, which is really wonderful. And that's pushed us to learn from them. What are the things that we need to do in our technology or in our services that help where we all are now, I like to try to say that we're coming out of this, but I'm not quite sure. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Stuart?
So I'll close out the answer to this question, Susan. First, thank you for the invitation to participate, and I'm honored to be among this esteemed group of colleagues. At Woodward Academy, we are a pre-K through 12th grade institution, and I think the greatest challenge that we have experienced during the time since the pandemic began in 2020 has been the level of participation of people who give to the institution. We set records in the amount of money we have raised over the last 2 years, particularly for our annual fund, but we've not had the rates of participation that we had pre-pandemic. And I think that speaks to the struggle that some of our families have experienced in just managing paying the tuition, let alone making a philanthropic contribution. We have heard from a number of our families who are able to make the charitable contributions of their gratitude that Woodward managed during the pandemic to remain open. We didn't in that first quarter after everything shut down, but we did return to in-person operation in the fall of 2020, have continued an in-person operation, and a number of families have been grateful that we have found a way to make that work. And I think the giving that they have made to the institution through our annual fund reflects that. But having more dollars given by fewer people has been a reality that we have dealt with the last 2 years, and I think will continue, especially with the economic climate that we're in right now.
Great. Well, thank you. So, Benny, here's a question for you. As major and mega giving continues to grow and individual giving influences other giving, such as the donor advised funds have grown to 6% of overall giving, it appears that lower level donors may be shrinking. And Stuart just alluded to that a bit. What impact do you believe the tax reform has had on individual giving? And secondly, what recommendations do you have to keep the individual giving pipeline thriving?
This may be a plug, Rachel, for your organization, because we use Blackbot, and it's been very, very important to helping us stay connected with our donors at every institution I've been a part of. I think, I'm not quite sure that the changes in tax laws and deductions really impact individual giving significantly. I think people are going to give because it's important to them. And I don't necessarily think people are trying to say, how much am I going to get, especially lower donors, how much money am I going to be able to do for my taxes in order to make that decision? I think during the pandemic, people that had lesser means or modest means had to pivot to make decisions about living and to make decisions about taking care of themselves and their families. Many of them had jobs where they were laid off, or they had to pivot. There was so much uncertainty in the market. So disposable income may have been less about giving through some organized donor method to basically serving their communities and their families. So they probably were still very generous, but not for the purpose of a tax deduction. They were still giving to their families, giving to their neighbors, giving at their churches at some level, but not in the context of the tax law has changed and now I have less deduction, et cetera. So I think what we're really talking about is how do we continue to make giving accessible and easy, where people can make those decisions, because a lot of it is impulse decision. I know a lot of my giving over the last 2 years has gone through GoFundMe. And so if you look at, I would love to see what the correlation between what happened with GoFundMe initiative, which is not a philanthropic arm, right, strategy, to people just being responsive to folks having needs out in the marketplace. So I think that level of $10, $100, $200 giving may have gone to GoFundMes. And so I think in the future, what we have to think about as we try to lead our organization is how do we invite those individuals and invite those causes to be platforms in our organization. So we tilted a lot of our platforms to create GoFundMe-like platforms that people can actually get tax deduction and actually do those things, even though they were not asking for it. We just wanted to capture that particular data to do that. And I think that's really what the response and the landscape for the future is really going to be about, is utilizing those types of platforms within the construct of our organization and allowing it to be much more donor-driven and less give to the pot, give to this organization, give to the University of South Carolina Upstate, which we still want you to do that. But you can do it towards things that are very, very important to you, and we can be stewards of those types of activities.
So interesting. Okay, Joanne. Foundation giving declined in 2021 after a record high in 2020. With rising inflation and interest rates, what would your recommendations be to development officers to securing foundation gifts in 2022? And then also, what trends do you see with general operating support and multi-year giving from foundations?
Thank you, Susan. Here's the good news, that foundations were designed to be a buffer against the quarterly ebbs and flows of corporate profits. So from that perspective, an endowed foundation in particular is really designed for these times. The challenge we have, that in my 23 years, it's the first time we've really had this much of a challenge. We had a little bit of this in 2008, and we looked at the other times of economic depression, is that where we used to say at HCA Healthcare, we anticipate we're going to grow at about 8% over time, right? 1 year might be 6, 1 year might be 12, but over time it's going to be 8. And we're going to give out 6. We can no longer have that assumption. And in particular, we can't even have that assumption for the rest of next year. And we lowered it to 6% this year already at the beginning. So all I'm saying is that foundations are recalibrating. So here's my advice. 1, begin the cultivation as early as possible, particularly for major gifts, because I'm lining up major gifts for next year. I've started doing that this year. Okay, so that cultivation process has to start earlier. It's an important opportunity to really make sure you still understand that foundation strategy, because foundations are either change their strategy a little bit, or some just took a year off to totally redefine their strategy after 2020. So all foundations are in strategic planning phases of some sort. Most, not all, but most are. We definitely were. And we have a new corpus of funds that thankfully our very visionary CEO put in 19 and 20 into the foundation that we now have to spend. So focus on diversity and focus on health equity in particular. Corporations are really looking at those 2 areas along with ESG. So when you go to a corporation, talk about, how are you all talking about ESG? What are your goals around ESG? Environmental, social, and particularly governance, because what is fueling this is the discussions at our board meetings, our corporate board meetings, and the increased stakeholder and shareholder activity, particularly as it relates to the environment. create opportunities for collaboration. We want to work collaboratively with other funders, and sometimes you can be our matchmaker. So you may have a project that we're interested in, but also someone we'd like to do business would be interested in. We're talking to all our suppliers. We would talk to Blackbaud, Rachel, and say, is there anything we could do together? So, I mean, that's the kind of conversations. And those are, I'd say those are about new by about 3 years. We've been having those conversations for about 3 years. They're in different phases. And then lastly, pay attention to leadership changes. Because if the leadership changes either at the CEO of the company or the president of the foundation, that's a time when you can see major strategy adjustments. So that would mean my advice. The other is buckle up, because I think it's going to be a really interesting time for foundations and philanthropy.
Oh, gosh. All right. So on to Rachel on corporate giving, which has also been volatile over the last few years. Thanks to pre-tax profits, it did see the healthy increase in 2021 after the decline in 2020. Now with inflation and the rise in interest rates, what would your recommendations be to development officers to secure corporate gifts in 2022? And then secondly, with more employees working from home, how do you believe this will impact workplace giving and volunteerism?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And Joanne, you're completely on it. I agree with everything that you just said. And you'll see that my thoughts actually really intersect with that. So we've already talked a little bit about how everything has changed. Like the way we're working has changed, how we're working, who is in the room when we're working. My 24-year-old son's bedroom is now my office at home because I'm working. I'm in a remote first world. I never thought that would be the case after, 20 some years of working in an office. So everything's changed. People are under a lot of stress. The world is kind of messy. And, the first thing I would say is that companies are really just like potential major donor givers. Treat them. You have to have a relationship. And so given that everything has changed for everybody, don't assume that you know what you think you know. So it's maybe they will still support you. Maybe they won't. Maybe their priorities change. Like there's so many things that are different over the last 24 months that you have to go in with a relationship focus and just have the conversation and ask. And I will tell you that most organizations, nonprofits approaching companies don't start by asking about our perspectives and what we're facing. They start by asking for money, almost way too quickly, instead of realizing that, hey, if we have a conversation, maybe we will find that solution together because we have things that we are trying to solve for. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is that because many of us are now in a remote world, although not everybody, some of it is hybrid, which makes it even more difficult. Some people virtual, some people not. We're looking for really meaningful ways to engage. So if your organization has any way that you can provide volunteerism or connectedness, is it a virtual volunteer opportunity? There are so few good virtual volunteer opportunities out there. Can you figure out how to help me get teams together all around the world? So how do I get these people together so they know each other, and feel more connected? And then when we do bring people together at our world headquarters for a meeting or something, that moment is so much more special. That how can you help them just have fun together and serve and feel good and take all of that goodness while they are together, because most of the time they're like me working out of what used to be my son's bedroom. So that's the second thing. The third thing is what Joanne commented on. ESG is super important. When I started in this work, I didn't realize I was also going to be basically an ESG professional. I didn't even know what it meant. But now we've done 4 social responsibility reports. We pay attention to the ratings. We do lots of things. And there are alignments with what nonprofits do and how they can help companies meet ESG goals. So go out and read that company's report and see what they're interested in. A materiality assessment gives you a really good idea of whether you have intersection with them. So for us, there's a lot on sustainability and racial equity. We made a 3-year major donation to Project Drawdown, which is a climate organization. And it's a philanthropic gift, but it's absolutely in line with the E in ESG. And the S is kind of fuzzy in ESG, but that's where social impact sits. And companies want to drive social impact and their employees expect it. And that leads me to just a final note, which also has been commented on. Not all giving or investment is charitable giving. There are lots of ways in which companies spend money, and nonprofits can be part of this situation for how they spend money, not just through, I got a gift from a person. So I equip the entire Blackbaud team with a service shirt every year, and build pride in the brand and the company. And I use an organization called Turn 90, which is a nonprofit that works with men coming out of the prison system who are most at risk for recidivism. And they have a print shop, and we spend a lot on these shirts every year. And so it's a social impact investment. It's not charitable giving. But there are all sorts of things like that. If you think about it from an ESG lens, what are all the things that a company could do to do good in the world? And how does my organization, my nonprofit, help meet those needs? So I think there's actually a lot of potential, maybe even more potential, but it starts with the conversation.
Great, thank you. So Eric, what impacts have the shifts in giving, both with the constituency groups and subsectors? What have the impacts been on your organization?
So first, I'm going to just applaud Rachel for that. Very eloquent. It's not charitable giving, but it's social impact investment. I think I'll start my meetings off with that because I do believe that, and you hear me talk about those who are participating with the engagement of Boys and Girls Clubs here in Middle Tennessee as investors. There is a said return that we can talk about what that is. But as I think about some of the shifts and the effect that it's had on our organization in particular, first I'll tell you, I joined the organization 2 years ago, right at the height of the pandemic. So while we were figuring out how to open, I was figuring out how to accept the job, which I interviewed with all online, met all of the board members and staff online before coming into the office just to see the physical space. That is also, as I think about that, there are a couple other people that we've hired recently in a similar kind of way who are looking to make impact and drive change. And the shifts in giving, which are a large part of some of the trends and things that we talked about, what was happening in the macroeconomy, what was happening in society with social unrest and all of that, that has had a profound impact. And starting with the staffing, I thought I'd start there. That has profoundly impacted our organization. But as I think about some of the more practical things that I believe are here to stay, some big things in the nonprofit world. Number one, there are less reliance on traditional events. And if you think about nonprofits in general, and we talk about this, while it's been 2 years, people who I have as mentors will tell you, there has been, in some cases, a large over-reliance on that type of fundraising strategy. So I do believe that trend has shifted and it's here to stay. Doesn't mean that they're going away, but likely fewer bigger ones. It's going to be the engagement strategy that you'll definitely hear from us, but I think you will hear in general from nonprofits. The other area, and again, I think there was a lot that the pandemic did to accelerate this, but there is more reliance on digital and innovation around that space now. What do I mean by it? We went offsite as well as a leadership team about after my first 100 days, and I was sharing the key findings of this, huge organizational assessment and community engagement. And coming out of that session, all done in a facilitated environment like this, we walked away with a new 5-year strategy that we were going to be about. So the notion of doubling the number of youth served and having them ready for a great future was born out of that. So it has set the foundation of what we are about right now. Our programming being set around 5 readies, preparing our youth to be ready to read, ready for class, ready to graduate, ready for a career, and ready to thrive in the community, have really set the platforms there. And digital has played a huge role, just that connectivity that once upon a time you would have put on pause. I would say the other thing in the area of digital space is just this profound realization that there is an opportunity to reach more members, more investors than ever before by the use of digital tools. So we now have a digital club called Club Next. And that's a programming that serves, I call it proof of concept because we're still in expansion, 100 youth that get reading support, math support, and access to a program. So if you could imagine, I estimate there's about 40,000 youth that need us the most, and we're serving about 5,000 now. Digital and digital programming and digital access is going to play a huge role with reaching many of them. So it has really set up the strategy and thus innovation coming off of a digital club that we have. Also, Code Academy, which is something that we launched, that we started online, but we now have a physical school not a physical school space and programming over the summer that has expanded during the school day, and about 3 schools here in the Nashville area that we see expansion on. So digital and that reliance on digital and innovation to not only meet the demands of what we know in the future, that's going to be the future workplace, but also just the connectivity of those members as well as investors has been an important piece. And then the last piece, I'll just say that intentionality or that go-to-market strategy approach are really saying that, hey, here's what we're going to be about over the next 5 years. And it does set up the opportunity to have different conversations with investors around those outcome-based things that we're trying to drive. Those have been the biggest ones that we talk about. Of course, things like inflation, and challenges I see in the back half, and that are kind of the day-to-day things you have to deal with. But those big ones there are ones that I think are here to stay and are going to change the landscape of our organization and likely many nonprofits as we move forward.
Great. Stuart, what do you believe should be the focus for organizations to be successful with fundraising when we hear about all this volatility?
Well, each of my colleagues and the responses that they have given to the questions you've asked of them have either explicitly or implicitly given the answer. And it's the answer that's always been true in fundraising, and it's relationships, relationships, relationships. Finding creative, meaningful ways to engage your donor base, to tell them the story of what your organization is about, and not just to assume that because you exist, you therefore deserve to receive financial support. It's really about getting to know the donor, learning what the donor's interests and passions are, and then inviting them to make an investment in the work that you are doing that will likely resonate with what they want. And of course, pre-pandemic, we imagined that the only way that could be done was in person or through writing of letters and emails, but we've certainly learned the value of virtual connection, the use of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and other electronic means to stay connected with our donors. Our team here at Woodward did a great job of reaching out to our donors during the depths of the pandemic when we couldn't be in person just to touch base. Benny gave a great example of what he did at Morehouse School of Medicine just by taking meals to the people that they served to make sure that they knew that they were still front of mind for them. So finding ways to stay connected and to build those relationships is what every fundraiser needs to be focused on. And recognizing it's not just the work of the fundraiser or the CEO of the institution, but everyone in the organization has a role in helping to cultivate those relationships.
So true. So before we get to this last question, I want to encourage our participants to go ahead and use that Q&A section and send any questions that you might have to our panel. So you just talked about technology. Eric talked about technology. I mean, everybody on this panel has talked about technology. So I'm going to ask a pointed question about that and the key role that it's playing with donor engagement and giving. What advice would you each have for our participants with regards to using technology? And I can call one of you out, or you can volunteer.
I don't mind volunteering for that.
Okay, Betty.
Start. I think technology is a gift. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And And I think it's critically important for professionals to get very, very comfortable with technology. Higher education is probably one of those entities and institutions, traditional higher education, that had a difficulty in changing. And when the pandemic came, the discussions about whether or not we're going to have more online degrees became null and void. We had to pivot within a week or so, or 2 weeks, to go from face-to-face learning to online. Now, what's going to differentiate us is the quality. How do we continue to have a quality learning experience and product and delivering these different types of modalities, right? So as it relates to fundraising, we got to help our donors become comfortable. We got to become comfortable delivering stewardship reports in a technological savvy way. So marketing and investment in marketing is going to be a premium increase on that. Creativity is going to be a premium increase. And I think just listening to your donors and your younger generations to help guide us through some of that type of creative and innovative ways. Things that we think are very attractive, long books and magazines may not be what's going to take it to the next level. So my advice to leaders and to teams is to get very comfortable and stretching and learning that next technology that's going to differentiate you from all the masses, going to amplify your voice and your message in a way that says, okay, I want to look at them versus them.
Anyone else like to add anything?
So I am not a tech person, even though I work for a tech company. But I will say that if you are not optimized for this, for giving on a mobile device, you should do that. On Giving Tuesday alone, the vast amount of money that the generosity that we processed, something close to 30% of all those donations came in via a mobile device, on a form on a mobile device. So if your website is not optimized so that it can show up and that giving form can show up on this little screen, you are literally creating friction and you are losing donations. So that's a very specific thing that your tech vendor should be able to handle. But if you're not on the current system that allows you to do that, you are literally getting in your own way.
Anyone else have anything?
I might just underscore, I think, what Stuart said around relationships. And if you think about digital and relationships, put giving aside right now, we all utilize tools that we were once uncomfortable with, that we're getting very comfortable with, to maintain relationships with our kids who may be older, with family members and friends that have extended across likely the globe. And so if you think about it, it's really an opportunity for engagement to just stay current and relevant around what are the multiple touch points now? And they're ever evolving, multiple touch points for me to continue to stay in touch, for me to continue to understand my investors' wants and desires and how those best intersect with what we're trying to drive as an organization. That's really kind of the mindset that I would say, because we all are living in a tech digital world. There's no way around that, and it gets more and more digital as we go. So that would be the last bit that I would add on that.
Great, thanks. We have a question from our participants. What advice do you have for organizations who are establishing endowment funds? Anyone like to take that one on?
Mine would be just be clear about the purpose of the endowment. I'm seeing a lot of gray area where endowments are being used for things that really weren't endowed. We're not traditional endowments. So if it's really, a fund that will help you keep your capital up to date, be clear, be transparent about your purpose of the endowment.
Great.
I think too, if you're starting an endowment fund, to ask the question suggests you don't have the experience or the practice in that area. So think about working with the community foundation as well to be able to participate that way, because the last thing you want to do is take on a commitment that you don't have the ability to steward and to effectively implement. So be very careful that you don't step into a space and you mismanage that particular opportunity and be a little bit comfortable working with your community foundation to build those types of funds and those types of opportunities as well. That can be very helpful to you.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our time. Is there any additional comments or thoughts anyone would like to add? Oh, thanks, Betty.
No, this has just been a great conversation. I've learned so much from, and I feel like we all know each other now. We're like intersecting, saying things that are all intersecting.
Right.
And Joanna, I had a tenure in Nashville, so I'm very familiar with HCA. You were extremely supportive when I was at Lipscomb University. And since you always shout out all of your religious affiliation, Lipscomb is a great, great institution as well.
I know there is a lot of intersection here. I could talk about that myself. But anyway, I want to thank you all so very much for giving us your time today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Harry.
Thank you, Anna, panelists, and guests for your participation today. We know you're all very busy, and we're thankful for your sharing your time with us. We're also grateful to the Nashville Post for partnering with Lighthouse Council to bring you insights from the leading global experts on philanthropy and social innovation. I hope that today's program has inspired you with discussions and ideas around the ways nonprofit boards and members and staff can succeed in the current economic and philanthropic environment. Lighthouse Council partners with respected nonprofits to develop and implement strategies that increase mission awareness, organizational effectiveness, and philanthropic support. We would love to hear from you. Please reach out if we can be of service in any way. Our best wishes to you.